A crisis solved without agreement. There was no vote, no signed document, no moment leaders could point to and claim success. Yet somehow the crisis passed, market stabilized, panic faded. And when it was over, no one could explain exactly how it had been resolved. To understand why this matters, we must return to a moment when agreement was impossible. Governments were divided, institutions disagreed, timelines collapsed. Every formal path required consensus that simply did not exist. And yet, inaction was not an option. The system needed movement, not permission. The first reveal begins with parallel decisions made in isolation. One authority adjusted its stance quietly, another delayed enforcement, a third signaled tolerance through silence. None coordinated openly, none committed publicly. But together, these fragments formed a pattern. Pressure eased not because a solution was chosen, but because confrontation was avoided simultaneously. The second beat followed as markets sensed a shift, not through announcements, but through behavior. Rules were applied more gently. Deadlines softened. Red lines blurred. Participants realized that strict enforcement had been paused without being repealed. The crisis lost momentum as uncertainty replaced fear. No one had agreed anything, but no one was escalating either. What made this possible was mutual awareness. Each actor understood the cost of forcing resolution. Each recognized that insisting on clarity would break the system. So ambiguity became the compromise. Silence became consent. The crisis was not solved. It was allowed to dissolve. By the time observers noticed calm returning, the window for agreement had already closed. Stability had been restored without decision, without accountability, and without record. The system moved on as if resolution had occurred, when in reality, it had been deferred indefinitely. This was not governance by agreement. It was governance by restraint. And it worked precisely because no one claimed ownership of the outcome. As the calm settled, the absence of agreement began shaping behavior more than any treaty could have. Institutions adjusted internally, treating ambiguity as a new boundary. Risk desks recalibrated. Enforcement teams slowed. What had been rigid expectations softened into flexible practice. The system adapted without ever naming what it was adapting to. The reveal deepened as this non-decision spread. Actors who might have pushed for clarity chose patience instead. Legal challenges were delayed. Deadlines quietly extended. Each choice was defensible on its own. Together, they formed an invisible ceasefire. Conflict did not end because it was resolved, but because escalation no longer felt rational. The conflict emerged in the background. Without agreement, there was no shared narrative, no lesson codified, no framework to prevent repetition. Everyone knew the crisis had passed, but no one could say why. Stability returned without understanding, leaving uncertainty beneath the surface. The system had survived, but learned nothing openly. The buildup intensified as time passed. Temporary restraint hardened into habit. What began as caution became precedent. Future decisions referenced this moment implicitly, using silence as justification. If restraint worked once, why not again? Agreement felt unnecessary. Coordination through ambiguity became normalized, yet this carried a cost. Without agreement, accountability vanished. Responsibility blurred. If outcomes worsened later, no one could be blamed or credited. Power operated without trace. Governance left no fingerprints. The crisis had been solved, but not owned. By now, a quiet truth had settled in. Europe had discovered a new mechanism of stability. Not consensus, not authority, but mutual hesitation. The ability to step back together without speaking. It was effective and deeply unsettling. The tension surfaced when the same pattern reappeared under different pressure. Another shock arrived, not identical, but familiar. Once again, agreement proved impossible. And once again, restraint filled the gap. Deadlines softened. Enforcement paused. Silence coordinated action better than any meeting ever had. The conflict sharpened as observers began to notice the pattern. Crises were no longer forcing decisions. They were being absorbed by ambiguity. This avoided collapse, but it also avoided resolution. Structural problems remained intact, merely suspended. Each time restraint was used, it became harder to return to clarity without triggering disruption. The buildup intensified inside institutions themselves. Officials questioned whether they were governing or merely delaying. Ambiguity reduced immediate risk, but it accumulated long-term uncertainty. Markets adjusted, pricing not policy, but expectation of future hesitation. Stability became conditional on continued silence. Public trust thinned quietly. Outcomes stabilized, yet explanations felt empty. Citizens sensed that decisions were being made without decision-makers. Power appeared everywhere and nowhere at once. Democracy continued formally, but critical moments passed without choice being expressed or recorded. Internally, discomfort grew. Restraint worked best when rare. Repeated too often, it lost credibility. What had once been a safety valve risked becoming default behavior. Crisis management blurred into permanent suspension of accountability. By this stage, the paradox was clear. Solving crises without agreement preserved systems in the short term, but weakened them in the long term. Stability survived, but meaning eroded. Without decision, there could be no learning. Without learning, the same moments would return again and again. Europe had learned how to avoid breaking, but it had not learned how to move forward. And the longer restraint replaced choice, the harder choice became to reclaim. The reckoning arrived quietly, without a triggering event. It came as realization. A system that survives by never deciding eventually forgets how to decide at all. Restraint, once a tool, had become a habit, and habits shape outcomes more than intentions. The climax unfolded when leaders finally acknowledged what silence had cost. Stability had been preserved, but direction had been lost. Crises no longer forced resolution, only repetition. Each moment of restraint deferred responsibility forward, compounding pressure instead of releasing it. What looked like calm was simply tension redistributed across time. This recognition shifted behavior. Silence was no longer treated as neutral. Non-decisions were framed as choices with consequences. Institutions began documenting restraint explicitly, naming when enforcement paused and why. Ambiguity was limited rather than celebrated. The system did not abandon flexibility, but it stopped pretending flexibility meant absence of authority. The resolution followed through modest but meaningful change. Deadlines returned with clearer conditions. Temporary pauses gained expiration. Crisis management regained narrative. Not every disagreement was resolved, but disagreement was acknowledged openly rather than hidden behind silence. Governance reasserted itself not through force, but through clarity. What endured from this episode was a warning. Stability achieved without agreement can save a system once. Repeated often, it drains legitimacy. Silence can calm markets, but it cannot build trust. Eventually, someone must speak and own the outcome. Europe did not reject restraint. It learned to recognize when restraint had become avoidance. So what do you think? When silence keeps saving the system, are we preserving stability or postponing the next crisis? A crisis